Hello, and welcome to your lecture on World War II, the Pacific War and Aftermath. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. Within 4 days of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941, the United States found herself facing a war on two fronts, against Germany and Italy in the European theater, against Japan in the Pacific theater. And Japan wasted no time after Pearl Harbor. Through the end of 1941 and beginning of 1942, Japan moved rapidly. She swept through the South Pacific, capturing European and American colonies. Japan seemed unstoppable until a decisive battle in June of 1942 proved that Japan could be beaten. Midway Atoll is a pair of islands approximately halfway between Japan and the United States. The United States had recently built a naval and air base there whence to attack Japan. And Japan figured if she could launch a surprise attack on that naval base, destroy the aircraft carriers that were stationed there, she would severely cripple the United States fleet and break U.S. morale. If this strategy sounds familiar, you won't be surprised to learn that the commander in charge of the Pearl Harbor attack was also in charge of the one at Midway. But there was a crucial difference between the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor and the surprise attack at Midway, and that was that the surprise attack on Midway was no surprise at all. American cryptanalysts were able to intercept and decipher Japanese messages about the attack of Midway long enough before it actually happened that the Americans were able to prepare. So it was that the United States countered the Japanese surprise attack with a surprise attack of their own. And although the Japanese forces outnumbered the American ones, the Americans were able to inflict a devastating loss on the Japanese, so devastating that although the Pacific War would turn out to stretch for another 3 bloody years, the Battle of Midway is considered the turning point in the war. After the Battle of Midway, Japan was on the defensive. Instead of attacking mainland Japan directly, aside from bombarding Japanese cities with bombs, the United States decided to employ a strategy called island hopping. In the strategy of island hopping, the United States would start by capturing the colonies that Japan had captured, island by island. They would capture these colonies, set up new bases, and use those bases as places whence to launch the next attack. In this way, they would use these captured islands as stepping stones to get closer and closer to mainland Japan. The fighting on these islands was brutal. In the Battle of Iwo Jima alone, almost 7,000 American lives and almost 22,000 Japanese lives were lost in a battle to capture an island that was only 8 miles square. Enemy bullets were far from the only danger on these islands, however. Disease was rampant, and although the forests were lush, they didn't contain that much food to forage, and so soldiers who had their supplies cut off often starved to death. I have here in this book, Japan at War and Oral History, it's an amazing book, please don't read it till you're much, much older, an account of a Japanese soldier on the island of New Guinea, which was the site of much fighting. My 3 years in New Guinea were a succession of horrors. Everything was beyond my control. Planes roared directly overhead. We could smell their thirst for blood. No matter how many flew over, you knew the one that was after you. Once I was just aiming my rifle when an enemy bullet actually got stuck in my barrel. If it had been a touch-off line, the umpire's call would have been, "You're out." A bullet went through a man's helmet, spun around inside, and exited through the same hole. Around his head was inscribed a bald line where the bullet had gone. How could you explain something like that? You move your body just a little, and immediately the place where you've been lying is hit directly. Luck? Accident? That just won't do it. I was forced to learn the limits of human intelligence. Things you'd think would logically be best for you often prove to be the worst. If you're going to die anyway, die gloriously, I'd think. I often volunteered for special missions. Yet again and again I'd come back and find it was the main unit that had been wiped out while I was off on a dangerous assignment. I felt something was controlling us. In the world we lived in on New Guinea, you'd no use for the language or knowledge you had accumulated before you went there. Literature, which I'd studied at Keijo Imperial University, meant nothing. I sensed that the extremes of existence could be reduced to the human stomach. Lack of protein, in particular, fostered a kind of madness in us. We ate anything: flying insects, worms, and rotten palm trees. We fought over the distribution of those worms. If you managed to knock down a lizard with a stick, you'd pop it into your mouth while its tail was still wriggling. Yet, under these conditions, a soldier offered me his final rice, and a soldier I met for the first time gave me half of a taro root he'd dug up. The extreme conditions in the Pacific War brought out both the best and the worst in humanity. The best was exemplified by the acts of self-sacrifice and courage displayed by both American and Japanese soldiers. The worst in the tactics employed by increasingly desperate governments. Japanese forces were becoming increasingly desperate. They were running out of supplies and men, and so the government decided to have the soldiers begin employing suicide attacks. There were many different kinds of suicide attacks, but the most famous were the kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze means divine wind, and it originally referred to the pair of typhoons that drove back Mongolian invaders in the 13th century. In the 13th century, when the Mongols invaded, the Japanese had no way to repel them, but just at the right minute, storms came down and destroyed the Mongolian fleets. And the thankful Japanese attributed this to divine intervention and called those storms kamikaze, divine storms, divine winds. Now, the Japanese government, desperate to protect herself against invasion and win the war, decided to use her own people as a divine wind to defeat the Americans. Kamikaze pilots were trained for one purpose: to load their planes with explosives, fly into the sky, and then crash land into the biggest, most powerful American ships they could find to take them down with them. These suicide attacks, these kamikaze attacks, horrified the Americans and cemented in their minds the perception that the Japanese would never surrender. Even facing the jaws of defeat, they would fight until the bitter end. This point of view, that the Japanese would not surrender unless they were facing complete annihilation, led the United States to drop the atomic bomb. On August 6th and August 9th of 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, one on the city of Hiroshima on August 6th and one on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th of 1945. This is the only time that atomic bombs have ever been used in warfare, and it is a testament to the destruction they wreaked that they have never been used again. Historians still debate whether or not the dropping of the atomic bomb was justified. Those who believe that it was justified point to the suicide attacks. They point to the high casualties in battles and say the Japanese would not have surrendered without the threat of total annihilation. They argue that if the United States had been forced to invade mainland Japan, it would have cost the lives of many American soldiers and many Japanese civilians and soldiers. In fact, U.S. military estimates at the time calculated that a land invasion of Japan could cost up to 1 million American casualties and many millions more of Japanese casualties, far more than were caused by the dropping of the atomic bombs. In response to that, many historians argue that Japan would have surrendered even without the dropping of the atomic bomb. They point out that Japan had had a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, that is, with Russia. Japan had in fact been hoping to broker a peace with the United States through the Soviet Union until the Soviet Union decided it would rather just break the non-aggression pact and invade Japan. Japan knew that she could not fight a war on two sides. She could not fight an invasion of the Soviets from the north and the United States from the south simultaneously. And so, even before a detailed written report of the events at Hiroshima had reached the capital, Japan had already convened councils to discuss the Russian invasion and to discuss terms of surrender. Other people argue that even if the atomic bomb did end the war, it was not justified because weapons as devastating as atomic bombs should never be used in warfare, and especially not against civilian, that is, non-soldier populations. Whether the use of the atomic bomb was justified or not, whether it ended the war or not, the effects of it were devastating. Fully 90% of the city of Hiroshima and 40% of the city of Nagasaki were destroyed. 40% for Nagasaki because the topography of the region prevented the blast from being quite as destructive as it had been in Hiroshima. Up to 140,000 people in Hiroshima, that was about a third of the population, and up to 80,000 people in Nagasaki were killed within a week of the dropping of the bomb. We will never know the exact numbers because the population records of those cities were destroyed in the blast. I say within a week of the dropping of the bomb because although the bombs did incinerate many people upon impact, there were many other people who sustained severe burns that killed them over the next couple days. In the weeks and months and years that followed, many people developed symptoms of radiation poisoning. Many of those symptoms did lead to those people's deaths. Again, we don't know how many, just many. On August 15th, 1945, the Japanese government surrendered. And whether it was out of fear for this new weapon, or whether the Japanese government was using it as a handy excuse, the emperor said in his radio broadcast that the surrender was due to a need to prevent the annihilation of the Japanese people. The war was over. Now it was time to pick up the pieces. Over the last 8 years, untold devastation had been wreaked across the world. How do you recover from something like that? The United States decided to occupy Japan, rewrite her constitution completely, and stay there until 1952. Even after the United States left Japan in 1952, she left military bases there. Those military bases are still a source of discussion and debate today. In Europe, the US-led Marshall Plan gave $15 billion to help rebuild Europe, help those countries recover. The United Nations was formed. Like the League of Nations before it, the United Nations was a group of countries formed in October of 1945 in order to settle disputes and prevent future wars, especially wars like World War II, from ever happening again. This time, the United States did decide to join, and the United Nations is still around today. In recognition of the intense suffering and persecution of the Jewish people, Britain decided to give part of her territory of Palestine to the Jewish people as a homeland. Thus, in 1948, the country of Israel was born. By and large, the Jewish people were happy about the creation of Israel. By and large, the countries surrounding Israel were not, and thus began a conflict in the Middle East that unfortunately continues to this day. Of all the wars in all the history of the world, World War II stands out as the bloodiest and the most devastating. It was begun by man's inhumanity to man. It was ended by man's inhumanity to man. And yet, amidst all this darkness, there shine examples of courage, of justice in the face of injustice, of humanity in the face of inhumanity. You have brave people in Nazi-occupied Europe risking their lives, their homes, their families, in order to save strangers, Jewish people whom they've never met, but whom they know do not deserve to die. You have people in internment camps creating communities, churches, and schools, making the absolute best of a bad situation. You have soldiers in the midst of the brutal fighting in the Pacific, giving their last portions of food to other soldiers that they might live. And, in some ways the most inspiring of all, you have instances of enemies meeting face to face and choosing to recognize each other's humanity, choosing kindness over cruelty, and camaraderie over carnage. One such occurrence takes place in the true story called In the Enemy's Hands by Kojima Kiyofumi. A reserve naval officer during the war, Kiyofumi later became a leader of Fusenheishi no Kai, the Soldiers Against War Association of Japan. As this section of his account begins, he is wandering through the jungle in the Philippines with his few remaining men, and they are rapidly running out of supplies. Many days passed. Now we had no salt and nothing to eat. We had to eat snails. So I mentioned surrendering again. This time they said, "Take us in, Commander." I recall at that moment looking up into the blue sky and thinking, from now on, I will have no nation. I will be alone. But I thought too, finally my fight is over. I don't think I was fighting for the emperor in the first place. If you'd asked me why I was fighting, I guess I would have said, for my parents, for my younger brothers. By chance we stumbled upon an American barracks. 4 or 5 sentries were posted outside. They were holding coffee or bread or something in their hands, their rifles off to the side. Everything went flying as they dashed into the barracks. We were there to surrender, yet we hardly knew how. In a moment, hundreds of them, all in field uniform, were aiming their rifles at us. It was a strange moment. We still had our weapons. I had a pistol in my belt and a sword at my side. We were so emotionally wound up, it's amazing we ourselves didn't open fire. I couldn't have complained had they shot me. The enemy formed a circle around us and drew closer and closer. They were shouting something at us. Suddenly I realized this wasn't captive style, the way we were, so I told my men to drop their weapons. The enemy still kept shouting. Our hands weren't up, but I honestly didn't know what to do. I'd never surrendered before. Finally, one of them beckoned to us, hand flat, palm up. So we advanced step by step. As soon as we were within reach, enemy soldiers jumped on us and patted us down, touching us all over. I know now they were checking us for weapons. My men had eaten nothing for days. They begged me to ask for something to eat. I was embarrassed to ask for food practically in the moment of surrender, but I did it anyway. They told me they just had breakfast, and as a frontline unit had to wait for more food from the rear. They were sending us back there in any case. The driver of my Jeep offered me a lucky strike. I was a heavy smoker and I hadn't smoked for so long. I drew it from the pack and thanked him, and he told me to pass it back to the others. The Americans were still holding rifles on us, but when we put our cigarettes between our lips, they lit them for us with a lighter. From that moment on, I think I could feel my closed mind opening up. When I finished that first cigarette, he gave me another. He gave me the entire pack. A swarm of enemy soldiers came out to see us when we reached camp. I guess they wanted to get a look at these funny-looking guys they'd caught. But when I saw them, blonde, silver, black, brown, red hair, blue, green, brown, black eyes, white, black, skin colors of every variety, I was stunned. I realized then that we'd fought against all the peoples of the world. At the same time, I thought, what a funny country America is, all those different kinds of people fighting in the same uniform. I discovered a new kind of country. We were put out in an open field with everyone staring at us curiously. 2 enemy men stood behind me. My soldiers, the 4 of them, were sitting off to one side, nobody really keeping them covered. I was envious of them. They looked more at home than I felt. When I again asked for food, I was told, "We've just finished lunch." But when I said we'd take anything, even water, they brought us water. When I told them we hadn't eaten for days, they brought us some canned food. I think it was corned beef. It was unbelievably delicious. After all, we'd been eating grasses. When we were finished, a soldier came up to us holding out a shovel. He told me to dig a hole. I turned pale. When Japanese soldiers captured enemies, they always had them dig a hole, made them kneel down, and chop their heads off, so I'd heard anyway. And it was me they'd brought the shovel to, not my men. I looked around desperately for some place to run, but all I saw was a wall of iron. So I resigned myself to my fate. I stood up shakily, and started to dig. I had no strength left, and the soil was as hard as a rock. My hole was very shallow. I thought, this will never be big enough for me. But the soldier took away the shovel and simply threw in the can I'd been eating from, and ordered me to collect the rest from the others and bury them too. I guess I looked stunned, so he added that it was a sanitation measure. Honestly, when I saw that shovel, it wasn't only me, all the men reacted in the same way. I was the one who'd assured them it would be all right, and now they all thought I'd been wrong. At the next military camp, out of a sentry box came a Nisei, a Japanese, in an American uniform. I can't tell you how strange that felt. He questioned us, but this time in Japanese. I asked him his rank, and he told me he was a first lieutenant. Then I asked him the date, and it was then I learned I'd been captured on April 13th, 1945. He informed me that his grandmother and grandfather lived in Hiroshima, and asked me what I thought of Nisei soldiers. Did I hate them? I realized he was genuinely worried about that, which is why he was being so kind to me. It gave me confidence. "You were born in America," I replied. "You're fighting for your country, America. I have no ill feelings about that." He was like me, and I did the same thing for my country. We ended up talking until 10:30 that night. In order to save his men and himself, Kiyofumi took a chance that the Americans were not demons, as he'd been taught, but people, and he approached them in open vulnerability and honest surrender. For their part, the Americans took Kiyofumi and his men at their word that they were there to surrender. They didn't suspect them of a grander plot or plan to stab them in the back. Instead of treating them like the rats and lice of propaganda, they treated them like people. And this recognition of common humanity in the face of an inhuman war, this choice of kindness over cruelty, ended up making friends of former enemies. May we all, if we find ourselves in similar circumstances, behave the same. Have a great week.